On Saturday and Sunday this weekend, the United States military struck Iranian radar facilities and drone command and control sites on Qeshm Island and in Guruk. Iran claims it responded by striking an American airbase. Kuwait activated its national air defenses. A teenager named Amir Hossein Hatami was executed by the Iranian government last month for protesting. His family still doesn't have his body. And in 48 hours, SpaceX starts the roadshow for the largest IPO in the history of financial markets. These are the stories of June 2nd. Not one of them is what it claims to be. Let's start with the language problem, because the language problem is everything this week. On Sunday morning, US Central Command posted on X that it had conducted self-defense strikes on Iranian radar and command and control sites for drones in Guruk, Iran, and Qeshm Island. The strikes happened on Saturday and Sunday. CENTCOM described them as measured and deliberate. The action was taken, CENTCOM said, in response to Iran shooting down a US MQ-1 Predator drone over international waters. US fighter aircraft destroyed Iranian air defenses, a ground control station, and 2 one-way attack drones. Iran claims it responded by striking the US Jaffar air base in Bahrain. Kuwait activated air defenses nationwide. Sirens went off across Kuwaiti residential areas. CENTCOM concluded its statement by saying American forces continue to defend our forces while using restraint during the ongoing ceasefire. There it is, the ongoing ceasefire. That phrase is doing more work than any single sentence should be asked to carry. In the last week alone, the US struck Iranian drone sites. Iran struck an American base. Iran shot down a US drone. The US struck Iranian radar infrastructure. Iran fired at Kuwait. The US disabled a cargo vessel in the Gulf of Oman. Israeli forces expanded into Lebanon. Kuwaiti air defenses activated twice. And the official framing for all of this, from CENTCOM's public affairs apparatus, is restraint during the ongoing ceasefire. The Hill covered the strikes. The Times of Israel confirmed the CENTCOM statement. House of Saud's military analysis outlet noted something specifically worth registering. In June 2019, when Iran shot down a US RQ-4 Global Hawk, a significantly more capable surveillance aircraft, President Trump ordered strikes in retaliation and then personally pulled them back at the last minute. The decision not to strike became a defining moment of that administration's Iran policy. CENTCOM struck within 72 hours of losing a drone, not an RQ-4, but an older MQ-1, and described the response as proportionate and restrained. The threshold has moved, the tolerance for escalation has shifted, and neither the administration nor its press coverage has acknowledged that shift explicitly. What the current situation is, by any operational definition, is a low-intensity conflict operating under a diplomatic fiction. Both sides need the fiction. Iran needs the ceasefire label because it needs the economic relief that a signed MOU would bring. The US needs the ceasefire label because a formal resumption of major combat operations would collapse the political argument that the war is being wound down, so both sides maintain the fiction simultaneously while conducting military strikes against each other's assets. And CENTCOM issues statements describing this as restraint. The fiction is not inherently stable. A measured and deliberate strike that kills personnel, or a retaliatory strike that destroys something the other side values more than a drone control station, ends the fiction overnight. The word ceasefire is load-bearing. It is holding up the market, the diplomatic track, and the domestic political narrative of both governments. It is doing this while both governments are actively shooting at each other. That is not a stable construction. It is a countdown. Now I want to talk about something that has been treated as a footnote in the coverage of these negotiations, and should not be. While the United States and Iran have been exchanging proposals about the fate of 440 kilograms of enriched uranium, the Iranian government has been executing its own citizens at a scale not seen since the aftermath of the 2022 protests. In the span of 8 days in late March and early April of this year, Iran executed at least 10 people connected to the January 2026 uprising and the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran. Among them was Amir Hossein Hatami, an 18-year-old arrested 84 days before his execution during protests in eastern Tehran. He was convicted of enmity against God for allegedly being present at a Basij base that caught fire during the demonstrations. His family told Iran International that eyewitness accounts and video evidence suggest he did not start any fire or engage in destruction. Amnesty International described his trial as grossly unfair. Before he died, Hatami said openly, "My goal was to overthrow the regime." He was hanged at dawn in Gezel Hazar prison. The Iranian government withheld his body from his family for at least 4 days afterward. This is not an unusual practice. It is a documented tool of additional punishment against grieving families. An act of cruelty that extends the state's coercion beyond the moment of execution. Amnesty International has documented at least 30 individuals who face capital charges connected to the January 2026 protests. Many of their trials took place within weeks of arrest. Multiple defendants have stated in court that their confessions were extracted under torture and retracted those confessions before judges who dismissed the retractions without investigation. Amnesty's statement on the execution said this directly: while the population faces mass casualties from bombardment, the authorities continue to weaponize the death penalty to silence dissent. The NCRI, which monitors Iranian human rights developments, confirmed this week that 2 more protesters from January 2026 were executed Saturday, Abul Hassan Montazir and Vahid Bani Amarian, on charges including armed rebellion and MEK membership. The Euronews brief from May 25 noted Iran executed 2 men over protests and alleged espionage, while a Tehran court sentenced 4 more to death in the same week. Here is the question the Iran peace coverage is almost entirely failing to ask. The MOU being negotiated would lift sanctions and unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian assets held in international accounts. The Trump administration has framed this as economic relief tied to performance. The faster Iran clears Hormuz mines, the faster the economic relief flows. That framing treats sanctions relief as a neutral transfer between governments. It is not. Those funds flow to a government that is, right now, hanging 18-year-olds who said their goal was freedom, withholding their bodies from their parents, and sentencing dozens more to death in proceedings that Amnesty International says depend on torture. Every dollar of sanctions relief that reaches the Iranian government under this deal is a dollar that reinforces the capacity of that government to continue doing exactly what it is doing to its own people. The Trump administration has said almost nothing publicly about the executions. Hegseth has talked about Iranian drones. Rubio has talked about Hormuz. Vance has talked about uranium. The executions have received a press release and silence. The people being killed are Iranians. They do not appear to be part of the deal's calculus. And yet the deal being negotiated is, in part, about what kind of Iran emerges from this war. An Iran flush with unfrozen assets and normalized oil revenues, governed by a supreme leader who just executed his citizens by the dozen for protesting, is a specific kind of outcome. It is worth naming. And now, 48 hours. The SpaceX IPO roadshow begins Thursday, June 4th. Pricing is June 11th. NASDAQ listing is June 12th. Retail investors using Robinhood, Schwab, Fidelity, SoFi, and E-Trade have been submitting indications of interest this week. Goldman Sachs leads a 21-bank underwriting syndicate. Target valuation, $1.75 trillion. The market environment for this listing, as of Monday morning, is as follows. The Dow is near all-time highs. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ both closed at records last week. The AI trade has sustained the tech-heavy indices through every geopolitical shock this spring. CNBC's Daily Open last week called it a market that simply does not flinch at the Middle East. And underneath those records, gas at $4.32 a gallon. Consumer sentiment at 44.8 pandemic levels. A Fed that may need to hike rather than cut. A 10-year Treasury yield that has been elevated all year. 40% of Americans in recent polling saying they have skipped meals or reduced food consumption due to cost of living. 2 ongoing military conflicts burning through oil supply chains. I have covered the SpaceX structure repeatedly this week, and I'm not going to repeat the full analysis. What I want to add is a specific observation about timing that nobody in the financial press is stating plainly. Every Iran deal announcement in the last 2 weeks has moved oil markets the day it was released. The May 24th announcement moved gas prices 14 cents in a week, a largest one-week drop since 2008. The May 28th announcement moved equity futures higher. The May 29th tentative MOU announcement dropped Brent crude temporarily. The market has been trading the ceasefire narrative like a commodity, because it is one. SpaceX is pricing on June 11th. The FOMC meets June 16 to 17. The May CPI prints June 10th. If an Iran deal is signed or even credibly announced in the 10 days before SpaceX pricing, oil falls, consumer sentiment gets a relief bump, equity markets surge, and the IPO prices into the most favorable possible market conditions. That is not a guaranteed sequence. It may not happen. But the incentive for a signed or announced deal to arrive in the June 4th to 11 window is very large, and the people most positioned to benefit from that timing are not the retail investors on Robinhood submitting IOIs this week. This is not a conspiracy. It is a set of convergent incentives that are worth being aware of. The administration wants an Iran deal before midterms. SpaceX wants to price at $1.75 trillion. An Iran peace announcement, even a provisional one, would help both objectives simultaneously in the same 10-day window. The person whose interests align with both outcomes is a man who is simultaneously the company's founder and a senior advisor to the president. I am simply describing the geometry of the situation. What you do with that description is up to you. What I am more certain about is this: retail investors buying SPCX on June 12th into a market whose record highs are being sustained by an Iran ceasefire narrative that dissolves every 72 hours when someone shoots down a drone. Those investors are carrying a risk that isn't priced into the enthusiasm of the roadshow. The record highs are real. The economy underneath them is not as healthy as the Dow suggests. The ceasefire underneath the oil prices is not as durable as the gas prices suggest. And the $1.75 trillion valuation is not as supported by earnings as the IPO prospectus suggests. 3 things that look solid on the surface, resting on foundations that have been cracking quietly all week. 3 stories. A ceasefire that involves regular military strikes and has been held together by the diplomatic equivalent of insisting loudly that the shooting isn't what it looks like. A government executing teenagers and withholding their bodies from their mothers, receiving almost no criticism from the administration, preparing to hand it economic relief. And an IPO roadshow starting 48 hours from now into a market propped up by the same Iran narrative that has been announced and dissolved 4 times without producing a signature. The thing that connects these 3 stories is not cynicism. It is something more specific: the systematic gap between the label applied to a situation and the reality of that situation. Ceasefire, peace deal, record economy. These words are doing work that the underlying facts don't support. And when words stop corresponding to reality, the people who know the difference aren't the ones buying at the open on June 12th.